For hundreds of thousands of years, humans lived in small, egalitarian bands where nobody was allowed to act like a boss. Then, about 10,000 years ago, something broke in our collective psychology, and we invited total strangers to rule over us. You might think kings emerged because people were lazy, or perhaps because some were just stronger than others. But the true origin of hierarchy isn't found in muscle mass or social contracts. It is found in a massive, irreversible shift in human biology, triggered by a single invention, the grain silo. To understand why you follow a boss today, we have to travel back to the late Paleolithic era. Imagine a world where your status is tied to your ability to share. If you hunted a deer, you gave the meat away. If you didn't, you were shunned. This was the original human condition. It was a genetic insurance policy. If you were selfish, you didn't survive the winter. We evolved to be hypersensitive to bullies. When someone tried to dominate the group, our ancestors banded together to cut them down to size. This wasn't just a preference, it was a biological survival mechanism. But then, 12,000 years ago, we stumbled upon the Neolithic Revolution. We started domesticating wheat, barley, and rice. This changed everything, not just because we had more food, but because of the physical nature of the food itself. Meat rots, milk spoils, fruit turns to mush. But grain? Grain is different. Grain is portable, divisible, and, most importantly, storable. You can pile it into a silo, and when you can pile it into a silo, you can exert power over someone's literal ability to stay alive. This is where the biological shift begins. Foraging requires constant movement. You cannot easily control someone who can just walk into the woods and disappear. But a wheat field, it takes months to grow. It requires your physical presence. And if a group of men decides to stand in front of your silo with spears, you are suddenly trapped. This gave rise to the first stationary populations. And with that stability came the birth of the first tax collectors. Think about the sheer audacity required to be the first person to claim, "This grain belongs to me." In a nomadic hunter-gatherer group, you would have been laughed out of the camp or killed for such an ego. But now, you had a monopoly on the survival calories of the tribe. People didn't start following kings because they respected them. They followed kings because the alternative was starvation or death at the hands of the king's newly hired thugs. This is the birth of the domestication hypothesis. Scientists like James C. Scott have argued that when we domesticated crops, we inadvertently domesticated ourselves. We became part of an ecosystem where the ruler was the farmer and the subjects were the livestock. Just as a cow is kept alive to provide milk, the early subjects were kept alive to provide labor, taxes, and military service. We traded our autonomy for the predictability of the harvest. But there is a deeper psychological side to this. This transition triggered a massive change in our oxytocin and cortisol levels. In small groups, our oxytocin, the social bonding hormone, was directed toward our kin and our immediate neighbors. When we moved into the massive, anonymous cities of Mesopotamia, our social biology hit a wall. We were living among thousands of people we didn't know. Our brains couldn't handle the complexity. We needed a shortcut to trust. The king became that shortcut. By creating a singular, divine figurehead, the state provided a focal point for our social instincts. We didn't need to trust our neighbor anymore. We just needed to trust the king. Or, more accurately, we just needed to fear the king's law. We outsourced our social cohesion to a throne. This created a new human hierarchy that felt natural because it mimicked the dominance patterns we had seen in primates, but on a scale that was entirely unnatural. Look at the evidence from the Uruk period in Mesopotamia, around 3200 BC. This is where we see the first written records. And what are they? They aren't poetry or philosophy, they are receipts. Thousands of clay tablets documenting rations of beer and barley. We see the emergence of the priest king, or the Ens. These early rulers didn't lead by inspiration, they led by bureaucracy. They counted your grain, they marked your land, they mapped the world into categories of the taxable and the wild. The shift was so profound that it changed the human skull. Skeletal remains from the early Neolithic show a decline in health. We were shorter, we had more cavities, and we had more bone lesions from manual labor compared to our hunter-gatherer ancestors. We were literally shrinking to fit the requirements of the state. But our brains were also adapting. We developed a tolerance for hierarchy. We learned to compartmentalize. We accepted the idea that one person's life was worth more than another's, provided that person sat at the top of the pyramid. If you want to see this biology in action today, look at the concept of the charismatic leader. When we are stressed or when resources feel scarce, we don't naturally gravitate toward democratic committees. We revert to our Neolithic defaults. We look for the alpha. We look for the person who controls the silos. We want the person who promises that if we just obey them, we will be protected from the chaos outside the walls. This is a biological hangover from the era when the king was the only thing standing between the village and total famine. But the most fascinating part is that this king reflex is not universal. It only exists where grain existed. In parts of the world where you couldn't easily store calories, like the Amazon basin or the steppes of Central Asia, hierarchy remained flat for thousands of years longer. These societies never developed the silo mentality. They never needed kings because they never had a resource that was worth the cost of building a state to protect it. They remind us that the system we live in today is not the inevitable result of human nature. It is the result of a specific biological interaction with a specific type of plant. We have spent the last 10 millennia trying to justify why some people are better than others. We invented divine right, hereditary bloodlines, and eventually the meritocracy. We tell ourselves that the hierarchy is efficient. We tell ourselves it is necessary for progress. But at its core, the hierarchy is just a biological mechanism for managing grain. Think about the modern corporation or the modern state. Are they any different from the early Mesopotamian temple complexes? You have the people who manage the resources, you have the people who protect the resources, and you have the people who provide the labor. The walls have just become digital. The silos are now bank accounts. The taxes are now interest rates. We are still the same biological creatures, responding to the same stimuli that forced our ancestors to kneel in the dirt before a throne. The question for us moving forward is whether our biology is locked into this pattern forever. We are no longer limited by grain. We have technology that can distribute resources instantaneously. We have the ability to communicate across the globe without needing a central intermediary to tell us what is true. Yet, we still cling to these ancient hierarchical structures because they feel safe. They feel predictable. They feel like a warm hug from a species that hasn't changed its core operating system in 10,000 years. Perhaps the first step toward a new form of human organization is realizing that the king was never a leader. The king was an adaptation to a storage problem, and we solved that problem a long time ago. We are living in an era of unprecedented transition. We are moving from a world of physical scarcity to a world of digital abundance. Yet we still operate our societies using a mental framework that was forged in the shadow of a grain silo. We prioritize the preservation of the system over the flourishing of the individual. We value the hierarchy over the truth. We maintain the king not because he serves us, but because we don't know how to exist without him. The hidden shift that created the first kings was a compromise. We gave up our freedom for the certainty of the harvest. We gave up our autonomy for the safety of the city walls. Today, the walls have crumbled, and the harvest is guaranteed by machines, not by the sweat of a peasant. So, why are we still kneeling? Maybe it's time to stop looking for a king to protect our grain and start asking why we ever let them count it in the first place. The throne is an artifact, a relic of a biological survival strategy that expired thousands of years ago. The future of human organization isn't going to be found in better kings. It is going to be found in the realization that we never needed them to survive. We only needed each other. And as long as we keep that biological truth in mind, the cycle of the throne might finally, for the first time in history, be broken. If we are truly the most advanced version of our species, then the greatest challenge we face isn't changing the world. It's changing our minds.